right. Thank you. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Nellie. Hi. Thank you all for stopping by and taking time out of your day. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Can I start by saying how excited I am to be in conversation with you today? I'm a huge fan of your work, an even bigger fan of you, and I know that this year alone you've received the Joan Mitchell Foundation.
Yes.
Very
exciting.
Fellowship. And then, the Whitney recently acquired a piece. You had a solo exhibition at Scottsdale MoCA. You have work currently on view at Ballroom Marfa, and an upcoming show with the Nerman Museum. So, coupled with being named one of the 6 artists to watch for this week by ArtNet, it's clear I'm not the only person who has a big admiration for your work and your talent. So for those of you who have not enjoyed seeing Teresa's work, it is actually at booth 910 today, so please go check it out if you haven't. And for today's conversation, I know I wrote down a bunch of questions because I'm dying to learn more. But I figured it would be a really casual conversation where we can talk a little bit more about your process and practice. Having been at the booth earlier today, I think that's the most common thread to keep pulling on that people are inquiring about. Tell us more about your work. Tell us more about Teresa. And so hopefully we can dive a little deeper if that sounds good.
Great.
Okay,
Yeah,
just toss questions at you.
Yeah,
okay,
sounds
good.
Great. Yeah.
So you're from North Dakota, and you grew up traveling through the national parks of the Northern Plains. Can you tell me more about your childhood and how it informs your work? I think that's been a big cornerstone of a lot of the conversations you've had about your pieces.
Yeah, I always like to start to talk about where I'm from, who I come from, and that's really important to how my work has come to be. And so on my father's side, I'm Mandan and Hidatsa from the upper Missouri River. And on my mother's side, I'm German-American. Her family immigrated over and were farmers in North Dakota. And my father worked for the National Park Service, which meant that we traveled around a lot. He was the superintendent of places like Little Bighorn Battlefield, Mount Rushmore, the Lewis and Clark Trail 200 years later, which the mission for that was really to travel and bring in the native side of the story to those places. And I think growing up in the Park Service system in a way was really interesting as a child because I got to learn history on many different levels. My father made sure that we know and understand our cultural heritage. And so that really all just combined together. And we spent so much time outside. We traveled. Every road trip was on the road, just driving, and just looking at these Northern Plains landscapes and being immersed in that landscape that really is so vast. And it's all, I think, about the details too, because there's so much expanse. Like, you really focus in on the details, and I credit that to forming a lot of the way that I see and a lot of what my work does now. And also, what those landscapes give is they give so much to you. And I wonder, as an artist, how to make a landscape, and not just sort of recreating what I'm seeing, but rather recreating what I'm feeling in those places, and how to kind of bring that visceral aspect into an object, into a material object. So, yeah. And I think like another interesting thing that Nellie and I touched on earlier briefly was, I don't have any answers for this, but one thing I've been thinking about too is kind of the interesting aspect of being a national park is meant for tourism. And so, for example, at Little Bighorn Battlefield, we lived in park housing inside the national park. And so at night, the gates close, there's no more tourists, and we have this place to ourselves. that has a really, intense history. You can really feel that in that place. It's also still a working cemetery, so that was what we lived next to for 5 years. But just like that interesting kind of tourism, private, public space, education, feeling like, how do you educate the public, talk about history? So, and I deal with abstraction, but all of those components are in there for me. And I also think abstraction allows for a sort of freedom. It allows for me to kind of touch on all these aspects and bring into something that's brand new, bring into a brand new object. So.
Well, it's exactly what we were talking about earlier before we hopped up on here was something that your work does so beautifully is it's so welcoming. It's very accessible in this way that you can walk up to them and there's this real sense of peace. I know that I experience when I'm with your work, and I'm curious from your point of view, for the intention of the viewer, the scale in which you're working, these natural materials that you're incorporating into this kind of, artificial material, and thinking through of some of the maybe the slow-looking aspect of the work. I know I have the great honor of living with one of Teresa's pieces now for a little over 2 years, and every day there's something very subtle that changes, with the light and the experience of being around and with your work. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit more about some of the intentionality of the slowdown too in this environment that you're creating.
My work is intentionally slow. I want it to be slow. I want, I want you to live with it, and I want it to keep revealing itself to you. I also want it to be a place that you can go to, and we kind of talked about like taking what you want from it at that moment in your life or at that moment in your day, and sort of in the same way, if you need to go for a hike or you need to go look at the ocean, or when you go to those places, you take what you need from that. And I sort of hope that kind of slowness in the work can provide that in the pieces. So,
yeah, I can say I personally live with one. I do experience that, and I think.
Also just scale-wise, there's something about the scale that I think too has a comforting aspect. I want the kind of a feeling with the large pieces that you can walk into it almost, but also that it has this kind of protective feeling to it. So, and I think some of that scale kind of adds to it, and the shapes, the sort of large shapes.
Well, I think maybe you can talk a little bit, just to keep pulling on the abstraction element of your work, with the scale, especially when you're very close to them at that scale. It is very welcoming. It is very much, take what you want and what you need, and, come back later if you need. And you were talking a little bit about, growing up in the National Park Service and this idea of welcoming visitors and the responsibility, even as a kind of a child, of feeling that need to welcome. And I'm curious, it feels as though the work has a bit of that element to it.
I hope so.
I would
love it.
You do.
I would love for it to have that.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, I have so many questions to go through for you, but and not to jump around, but I'm curious too. You've spoken in the past about some of that oral storytelling too. That's been a big part of the work, and some of the materials that you've chosen to include as well. Do you want to speak a little bit about those details?
I grew up around storytelling. It was just a part of my life since I was a baby, and with abstraction, I think for so long I thought, abstraction can't be storytelling, but I realized it is. It has all of these elements. I was just kind of thinking in like a linear way, but it's not. And the materials get to speak for all of that. The materials get to stand in for the willows we used in our earth lodges, we used in our baskets. So that material in itself holds so much history, and just kind of thinking about it in a new way and as a new mark making. And then just in my pieces alone, I've spent years trying to figure out their material relationships, their language, through this intuitive practice and this kind of reactive process, really, and with the process-based practice. So,
it's there. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So I know you went to Fordham,
Yes.
and later the California College of Arts for your MFA. Can you tell me more about why what spoke to you in choosing those programs?
I went to, because we moved a lot, I ended up going to high school in Nebraska, and for me, I just wanted to just get to New York City. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I just needed to get to a big city, kind of experience this new thing that I was raised in. So I became an artist later on. I didn't know that I wanted to be, and took an art class, just kind of found a language that I hadn't been exposed to. Of course, I was surrounded by art growing up, but the idea of an artist in that time, from how I was raised, wasn't quite what I had been seeing. So learning about different abstract artists, sort of through that kind of art historical lens, it really spoke to me. And so that started that. And then I went to grad school at CCA. I wanted to go to the West Coast and have a proper art school education, just because I think it offered the time and the conversations and all the things that I didn't have in undergrad. So, but it was all very helpful for where I was at in my trajectory. So,
I'm really curious too about these works that you have, this body of work that you've created, and maybe speaking a little bit about the residency you just had. I know it was really kind of imperative to this body of work that you've created.
Yeah, I got to spend 3 months in Fogo Island in Newfoundland. It was a little tiny island off of Newfoundland, off the coast of Canada, and it was incredibly peaceful, and we were outside all the time. It was almost kind of reverting back to how I was raised. We didn't have a TV, I barely got on the internet. It was just complete removal and slowing down. And my studio view looked out at the ocean. I mean, it was a really incredible time. Was that a photo of it?
Yeah, I was going to say we have some works.
Oh,
yeah.
okay. I haven't been looking back here. A lot of the colors, I really got into red. There's just there's this really beautiful kind of deep coral red color, and I just kept red kept coming up in my work. I found red astroturf. I just really developed kind of an obsession with that color, which I actually normally don't use. And I think that there's even a little bit more of an architectural quality happening in some of the pieces that are in the booth, and just very a lot more squares, and so I just think I was really responding to a lot of the shapes I was seeing outside my window, some of the architecture that I was working in, but just even personally, it was a really really amazing place that I think will continue to come into the work. So they're incredible. And I think you touched on, I think, that the hot word that everyone is tell us more about this, the astroturf and the materials. And do you want to talk a little bit more about this medium that you are kind of working and reworking and appropriating in new ways? Yeah, so when I started working with astroturf, it was from really a practical level. It was from kind of a continued search for this material, not knowing it was astroturf, but just for this magic material that kind of gave me a ground to respond to. It gave me a support structure that I didn't need to have a backing for. It could hold my shapes. It wasn't floppy. It was just like all these like kind of, yeah, that's Fogo Island.
Yeah.
That was my studio. Oh, there's me.
It's beautiful. And that photo's so great.
And yeah, so anyway, yeah, so the AstroTurf, it was an accident. And because I have a process-based practice, it's like a lot of that is like staying open to accidents and being really excited when I'm like searching for something else, and then this other thing happens, and it just feels like magic a little bit. So this was the color of AstroTurf that I saw at a Home Depot I lived in Beaumont, Texas, and it was unexpected. I did not have a relationship with it. I think especially like growing up in the northern part of the U.S., like there's no AstroTurf. It's a very like southern, I think, material, and it felt really open. It felt like kind of mysterious. It also just felt blank in a way, and the yarn was like I was shaping it and really excited because I could make these large scale works, and immediately when I put the yarn on there, it looked like a drawing line, and it like had a freedom and it had an energy to it, and it had a connection. Like it holds, so when I'm working, I can move the yarn around and it sticks, and so process-wise for me, that opened up a lot of freedom, like kind of got rid of the preciousness essentially, which is important. And I have a drawing practice that also I have that kind of same approach with, and I guess as an artist, I feel like hitting that freedom point is when the work kind of gets to live and sing and like feel energetic. So yeah.
Well,
that piece was started in Fogo, finished in LA. But
well, you hit on something that I love to talk about, especially with artists, is process, because I know 90% of the magic is in the studio, and I thought maybe for those of you who have not visited her studio or been with you in your studio, can you tell us a little bit more about just your process from kind of like, I know drawing is a big component too, as you're kind of linking it through these organic shapes, and some of the materials that you're choosing, and maybe why you choose them, how you choose them. Do you listen to music while you create? What are the influences in the studio that
my
you're
influences
referencing?
really start with the materials. I think those are always my influence. I rarely listen to music. I find it too distracting, actually. Like I can't hear words. Otherwise, I can't like be present with what I'm doing. Sometimes I'll play classical music or something, but I don't play music really. And I started working outside in LA, and I have a Hidatsa garden that I grow in the summers. And I don't have this material in the pieces in the booth, but like I started bringing in dried Hidatsa corn husks, and it was that relationship with working outside that really also helped me kind of expand of like, not getting too stuck on some of the materials I'm using, and thinking a little bit about fragility, thinking about these materials that I'm used to seeing and used in a different way, but trying to look at it in a new light and trying to see that relationship with my work and how they get to speak for, they get to kind of ground the work, I think, the natural materials I use, and especially with that AstroTurf, that synthetic. So, but my process is really kind of back and forth. Like I love to like move around and play, and I have like, sometimes there's some stress with it, trying to like figure out the piece, but it's 3 or 4 pieces at once, and I move back and forth. And yeah, that's like, I feel like that's where I get to kind of perform in a way, with just me and the work, and that's where it's exciting. I love being in there, so.
Yeah, again, process is maybe one of my favorite things to talk about.
Yeah.
And, this is a kind of my own personal burning question is, if there are artists or a collective of artists or kind of inspirational points along this journey of as you really are working with this material and thinking through abstract landscapes that you often kind of come back to or reference, maybe either more formally or just informally in thinking about your work.
Yeah, I actually wanted to just touch on some of the inspiration. I'm happy to talk about artists as well, but even my own family, I come from a family of makers, quilt makers, sewers, and I think sometimes what is like so inspirational for me is seeing maybe like a little thread that isn't quite straight, or I see the artist's hand in those subtleties. And that's really exciting, and that's where like the personal comes in, and so that's a big inspiration. I also wanted to say my friend Ishi Glinsky is here, and he's definitely an inspiration, amazing artist. And I've had like throughout my whole starting out making work, I saw a Richard Tuttle piece when I moved to New York, and I was like, what is this? Like, this is incredible. I love Richard Tuttle's work. There's so many. There's I could list a whole group of them, but it's not all I think I respond to work that I feel like is visceral, that has energy. Catherine Bernhardt's paintings, I think, have a lot of energy. Diane Whitehawk, I think, makes incredibly gorgeous paintings, and I love her use of materials. There's a lot, but so.
Yeah. Well, that's good that you've answered my burning questions. It's like, I wonder, and seeing those threads kind of be pulled together is really exciting. And
Eva Hesse, when I lived in, she was really informative too. So
I thought maybe we could talk briefly a bit about kind of the work itself. And I know you're very concerned with autonomy and power as it relates to the work. And I'm curious how you might break that down with any one of the pieces that might be in the booth. Like, how are they autonomous, and what gives them the power?
I guess I'm concerned with autonomy because I think that that's where each piece gets to live as its own thing, and that I think is the power within it. And I think abstraction allows to get to that place, allows to get to that autonomous place, and I always want to get to a point where I can't place the work. There's associations for the viewers sometimes potentially, and that's great and okay, but when it's done or when I'm looking at it, I can't place it. I can't look at it and say you are this or you are that, and it gets to become its own thing. It gets to become its own object that kind of has a life. And so that's why I get so obsessed with autonomy, because I really want that for the work. I really want that for each piece. So I think that's tied into the power of it.
It feels like they're in conversation with each other at times too when they're together. You want them to be together too.
They feel good, and they have such relationships in that way.
Well, I want to go back to some of your travels, and I know that because landscape is such a big part of this and it really informs the work. How have your travels actually outside of the United States? I know with your recent residency and these different kind of some of the dramatic landscapes that you've visited recently, and how that has, especially with this body, I know there's a few of them that are even named after Fogo Island and other places you've traveled.
There's a few things. I think once I leave, I always go back to home, and I'm like, oh, that place is amazing. I love where I've traveled to, but it makes me remember and appreciate over and over what is so special about place and family and land, and how that's all tied. It goes beyond, it goes in many directions for that. But I also, travel comes at different points in my life, and I think sometimes just leaving just to appreciate is really important. But of course, it opens up your eyes to so many different cultures, and I love that. And Fogo Island, I did name quite a number of pieces after Fogo Island, or rather the landscape or what I was seeing in Fogo, because it was one of the first. I made a lot of work there, and a lot of those pieces came from that place, and so I wanted to really bring that in through the titles, and yeah.
Well, I am not the only person that may have questions for you. I was curious if anybody else has any questions, maybe for Teresa, about the work or her practice, especially after hearing her speak about it today.
Yeah, so color, that's not true. I don't have a ton of control over the AstroTurf colors anyway. So I love the challenge, though, of like what I can find, because that kind of gives me a starting place to respond to. So I'm always searching for different colors of AstroTurf. I do bring in spray paint, so I can adjust that a little bit. But color for me is really I love the kind of like instant, like intuitive response that I want to do. So I think a lot, like there's a piece, I wanted to talk about one particular piece, Hidatsa red, and that red, like, it's not that piece, but it's that red color. And I just felt like that red had so much, it was so loud, and it had, it was like slightly garish a little bit, but like, I wanted to kind of build on that power. So I think of the colors in relationship to like what kind of feeling they're giving me and like what I want the piece to become. And then I respond with another color based off of that. So, and then I'm always thinking of like ways to soften. So like with that red, I softened with the buckskin, sort of texturally, but also like that kind of like muted tan color. And then I wanted to like heighten some like metallic ideas in that. So I wanted it to be like a really forceful piece. That's how I think in terms of color. I'm not sure how direct of an answer that is, but I guess it becomes intuitive, and it becomes like thinking a lot about like the feeling, and then if I have like a blue, how to kind of brighten that blue, how to brighten that ground, and like, so that's why I've been adding a lot of orange, but I've really been working with a lot of orange and yellows lately too. And those are traditional Hidatsa colors that we used a lot. So I guess there's not a total straight answer, but there's like kind of all these components that come into building the color choices. So. Yeah, hey Tony.
I have a couple of questions. In terms of the artificial, in terms of the material part,
Yeah.
and the organic,
Yeah.
utilizing a lot of the ashes, maybe quality, some sort of barn.
Yeah. 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 Yeah, for sure. And I think it's also, I just lost what I was going to say. I think it's also reflective of adaptability and sort of responding to what you're given and working with what you're given and kind of moving on and making something beautiful. And just like adaptability as a culture, I think is a lot of what those two materials represent as well for me. So, and then, yeah.
And then as a what intrigued me and I really liked about the painting
Yeah.
is that it felt almost as aerial mapping.
Yeah.
There was a sense of the sort of displaced
Yeah.
connection to land and vernacular.
Yeah.
That's what I like the land that has a sense of vernacular.
Gotcha.
Where you are.
Right.
Also has a sense of recording. That time, that place.
Yeah.
Experience of the earth.
Yeah.
Miami, Los Angeles,
Yeah.
the next exhibition, but it contains some sense of connection to source.
Yeah.
That place
Yeah.
inspired. And that's what the question. Also not that. Maybe I'm looking at it the wrong way.
No. I don't see it too much as aerial. Actually, I think I see it more as like entering in and looking around. You know, I see it more as like kind of a horizon. You know, there's no particular horizon lines because I don't want that, but I more thinking of like immersed, like looking up, down, forward, back. You know, it's like that kind of that feeling. There's aerial points because it's that kind of goes into that idea. And then thinking about territory and boundaries, like I also think about how shape and irregular shape allows not only practically like the eye to move on and off the piece, but just that idea of land continuing and not having boundaries. So there's a little bit of a romanticism, honestly, in there to kind of like, we don't live in that world, but thinking about what that was when we did. And I mean, well, there's always boundaries, but you know, like land just like continuing. So, yeah.
Great questions. Are there any other questions? No? All right. Well, Teresa,
I thank you so much.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.